In about an hour, former special counsel Robert Hur, who investigated Biden's handling of classified documents, will testify in front of the Republican-led House Judiciary Committee. And this morning, NBC News confirmed Hur will testify as a private citizen and not a Justice Department employee. NBC News Chief White House correspondent Peter Alexander has more.
This morning, after a year of public silence, Special Counsel Robert Hur will testify before Congress. Hur, a former U.S. attorney appointed by then-President Trump, has faced fierce backlash following his report about President Biden's handling of classified material, saying he found evidence the president willfully retained documents, but not enough evidence to prove his case to a jury, citing, among other reasons, that President Biden would come across as a sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. The president quickly doing damage control.
I'm well-meaning, and I'm an elderly man, and I know what the hell I'm doing.
Following his feisty State of the Union, President Biden is still trying to dispel voter concerns about his ability to serve a second term.
I'm not a young guy. That's no secret. But here's the deal. I understand how to get things done for the American people.
Mr. Trump seized on the report last month.
Crooked Joe got off scot-free. Now, I don't know if you call it scot-free. They said he was a mental basket case.
In fact, Hur did not say that. Still, House Republicans today are likely to accuse her of giving President Biden a pass and to press him for additional observations about what Hur called Joe Biden's diminished faculties. House Democrats are likely to zero in on Hur's conclusion that no criminal charges were warranted. And they'll also underscore Hur's distinction between President Biden, who cooperated with the investigation, and Mr. Trump, who prosecutors say repeatedly refused to return classified documents and obstructed the investigation into his conduct. He's now facing 40 criminal charges. Overnight, a key witness in Mr. Trump's indictment speaking out on CNN, describing moving those classified documents at Mar-a-Lago.
They were the boxes that were in the indictment, the white banker's boxes. That's what I remember loading.
And did you have any idea at the time that there was potentially U.S. national security secrets in those boxes?
No clue. No, I had no clue.
NBC's Peter Alexander with that report. Let's bring in NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli, who has new reporting on the transcript of Biden's interview with Hur. And Mike, tell us about that and what more might we expect to hear from him today as a citizen? What's the difference?
Well, Mika, when you think back to last week, the State of the Union address, you saw just how overjoyed Democrats, even those Democrats in the room, were at the president's feisty, as Peter Alexander just described it, performance. But that reaction was in part based on just how worried Democrats were a month earlier when the special counsel, Robert Hur, released that damning report with his assessment that the president was an elderly man with a poor memory. Now, I had a chance yesterday to read all 260 pages of the transcript of that 5-hour interview that took place over 2 days. And what you find when reading that is a much more nuanced picture of that series of back and forth with the special counsel and his team than was presented in the report, and that's been shorthanded now. You see the president often asked very technical questions about how he consumed classified information, how he retained, whether he retained documents, where they were moved as he was leaving the vice presidency. Biden at times flashed anger at some of these questions that he thought went well beyond what anybody should be expected to recall. He often also flashed some humor. In the very first page of this transcript, the president is told by the special counsel that he's going to ask him about issues going back more than a decade. And Biden jokes, well, I'm a young man, so that shouldn't be a problem. He often also takes some questions he's asked and goes into very vivid details about things that happened more than a decade ago. At one point, they're looking at a picture that was found in Biden's possession of a trip he took in 2011 to Mongolia. I happened to be on that trip with then Vice President Biden more than a decade ago, and he recalled things that I had to look up myself to sort of verify were the case. And so there are certainly moments here in which, yes, the president does show that he struggled to remember certain things, or at least had a difficult time recalling things. The most important one was one that NBC News first reported about. It was, in fact, the president who raised the timing of his son's death, not special counsel Robert Hur. He brought that up in an important context as Hur was asking him to describe what documents he was using and how he was storing them in 2017 when he first left the vice presidency and was embarking in life as a private citizen for the first time. The president at the time says that it was at around that time that his son Beau was diagnosed with cancer, something that had actually happened more than 2 years earlier. And so that has been certainly a flashpoint on which Hur based part of his assessment here. But when you read the full context, the president uses that question to launch into a much more detailed series of discussions about the series of events that led from him leaving, making the decision not to run for president in 2015, and ultimately doing so in 2020.
So you saw a lot of detail that showed the president's memory was quite intact. Does the transcript undermine the assessment that the special prosecutor made in his assessment of the president's sort of, I don't know the words he used exactly, aging man with a poor memory or something, or does it even out somehow?
Well, Mika, I think an interesting signal about how the politics may play out on Capitol Hill today comes from the fact that just in the last few moments, the Democrats on the House Judiciary Committee have now posted the full transcript. It was sent up to Capitol Hill this morning, and it was Democrats who first posted that transcript this morning. I believe that they see what many in the White House who I've talked to about this see, which is that the fuller picture here does help present the fact that the president was able to recall events with great specificity and talk about a very complicated series of issues over the course of a long period of time. Mika, you have spent some time with President Biden. You've talked to him. As I was reading this, I also reflected on the fact that somebody who spent more than 16 years at this point covering Biden as closely as anyone, the conversation ensued in a way that it often does when you have time to spend with the president and he talks about these stories. And so rather than talking about whether this undermines her, I think it certainly gives Democrats an opportunity to challenge her about why and whether it was appropriate for him to make the kind of assessments in his report that he did.
Interesting. NBC's Mike Memoli, thank you very much